The wind was a blade against the thin walls of her cabin. Alara huddled closer to the meager fire, the wool of her blanket a rough, useless comfort against the deep chill that had settled in her bones years ago. It was the cold of exile, a frost that had little to do with the weather. Her pack had cast her out, their judgment a brand on her soul. Barren, weak, useless. She had been left to the mercy of the northern wilderness, a fate most considered a slow death sentence. And perhaps it would have been, if not for the sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, a strange trick of the blizzard shrieking outside. But it came again, a thin, desperate cry nearly swallowed by the gale. It was the sound of a living thing. A small thing. Fear warred with a deeper, older instinct. The woods were filled with predators, and she was prey. But the sound was not that of a beast. It was a whimper, a plea. Wrapping the threadbare blanket tighter, she unbarred the heavy wooden door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it against the interior wall. Snow swirled into the small room, instantly dousing the weaker flames in the hearth. A maelstrom of white and ice roared in the doorway, and there, on the stone step, was a bundle of furs. It was small, impossibly so, and shaking violently. From within its folds came the cry that had summoned her. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was a trap. It had to be. A sick joke played by the pack she'd once called home. She reached down, her fingers numb with cold, and brushed the snow from the bundle. A tiny face, pale and pinched, looked up at her. A babe. A pup. His eyes were squeezed shut against the storm, and his whimpers were growing weaker. Pinned to the furs was a scrap of parchment. The ink was bleeding in the wet, but the single word was brutally clear. Defective. Rage, hot and sharp, cut through the cold. It was a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. She scooped the bundle into her arms, the weight of it almost nothing, and fought the wind to drag the door shut. The cabin was plunged into near darkness, the blizzard a muffled roar outside. She carried the pup to the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. As the light grew, she unwrapped him. He was sickly thin, his breaths shallow. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, the tiny limb bent and useless. His fur, where it had grown in, was patchy. He was the runt of a litter, discarded like trash. Left to die so the pack wouldn't have to carry the shame of his imperfection. Something inside Alara, a place that had been frozen for years, cracked open. She saw herself in this small, broken creature, the worthless, the discarded. "No," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. She cradled him against her chest, sharing her own meager warmth. "They will not have you." She named him Fen. The first few weeks were a blur of terror and exhaustion. Fen was fragile, his hold on life tenuous. He cried with a pain she couldn't soothe, and he struggled to feed. The healers in the pack would have had herbs, tonics, the knowledge to ease his suffering. Alara had nothing but a desperate will. She foraged for what little she could find under the snow, boiling roots into a thin broth. She held him for hours, her own heartbeat a steady rhythm against his frail body, whispering stories of the sun and the summer he had never seen. When the fevers came, she bathed his tiny body with snowmelt, her hands trembling. During one particularly bad night, when his breathing hitched and his skin felt like fire, she thought she was losing him. Panic seized her. She pressed her hands to his tiny, heaving chest, tears streaming down her face. She poured every ounce of her own life, her own desperate hope, into her touch. "Live," she begged the darkness. "Please, just live." A strange warmth bloomed under her palms. Not her own, but something else. A faint, gentle heat that seemed to flow from her into him. Fen's ragged breaths evened out. The feverish heat of his skin lessened. He settled into a deep, peaceful sleep. Alara stared at her hands, confused and shaken. She dismissed it as a trick of her exhausted mind, a phantom of her desperate wish. Years passed. The wilderness that was meant to be her grave became their home. Alara grew hard and lean, her senses sharp, her knowledge of the forest absolute. She learned to hunt, to track, to read the signs of the changing seasons. The cabin was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary. Fen grew. He was a quiet, observant boy with eyes the color of a winter storm and a smile that was like the first thaw of spring. His leg never healed properly. He walked with a pronounced limp, his gait uneven. But he never complained. He was clever and kind, his heart full of a light that defied the darkness of his beginning. He was her whole world. The empty, frozen part of her had been filled to overflowing by her love for him. The brand of barren had become a bitter irony. She had not birthed this child, but he was hers. He was her son in every way that mattered. She taught him the names of the trees and the stars. He learned to carve small animals from scraps of wood, his little hands surprisingly nimble. He would sit for hours, watching her, his gaze full of an adoration that mended the broken pieces of her soul. She never told him how he came to her. To him, she was simply Mama. It was the only truth he needed. He was 6 years old the day their world ended. They were in the small clearing behind the cabin, gathering firewood. Fen was laughing, trying to catch snowflakes on his tongue. The sound echoed in the profound silence of the snow-laden pines. It was a happy sound, a dangerous sound. Happiness was a beacon in a world of predators. The scent hit her first. Ozone, pine, and something else. Something ancient and powerful and male. It was the scent of an alpha, not just any alpha. This was a scent of crushing authority, of absolute power. Ilara froze, her hand tightening on the small axe she used for splitting kindling. "Fen," she whispered, her voice tight, "get behind me, now." Fen's laughter died. He scrambled behind her, his small hand clutching the back of her tunic. From the deep shadows of the forest, a wolf emerged. It was a creature of nightmare and legend. Massive, its shoulders as broad as a man, its fur the color of shadow and silver. But it was the eyes that stole her breath. They glowed with a faint internal light, the color of molten gold. This was no ordinary wolf. This was a king. Ilara's blood ran cold. She recognized the aura, the sheer weight of his presence, from stories told in hushed whispers around the firelight of her old pack. Kalen, the Alpha King of the North. A warrior king who had ruled for centuries, whose grief for his lost mate and heir was said to have frozen his heart. What was he doing here, in her forgotten corner of the world? He took a step forward, the snow crunching under his paws. His golden eyes were not on her. They were fixed on the small boy hiding behind her legs. The predatory focus was terrifying. He was looking at Fen. Ilara raised her axe, a pathetic gesture against such a creature. "Stay back," she snarled, the sound a weak imitation of the growls she had heard from true pack warriors. The great wolf ignored her. It took another step, its gaze locked on Fen. A low sound rumbled in its chest, not a growl of aggression, but something else. Something that sounded like disbelief. Then, in a shimmering distortion of the air, the wolf was gone. In its place stood a man. He was as imposing in this form as he had been in the other. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark leathers and furs. His hair was black as a raven's wing, streaked with silver at the temples. His face was harsh, carved from stone and sorrow, all sharp angles and unyielding lines. But it was his eyes that held her. They were no longer molten gold. They were the color of a winter storm, a swirling gray that held the memory of unimaginable loss. And they were staring at her son. The scent. he said, his voice a low rumble like stones grinding together deep underground. It cannot be. He took a step toward them. Ilara stood her ground, her body a shield for Fen. Who are you? Kalin, the Alpha King, demanded. His gaze flickered to her, dismissing her in an instant, before returning to Fen. Who is this boy? He is my son, Ilara said, her voice shaking but firm. The king's gaze finally, truly landed on her. It was heavy, analytical, cold. He took in her worn clothes, the calluses on her hands, the fierce, terrified defiance in her eyes. Then his gaze dropped to Fen's twisted leg. A flicker of something, pain, anger, confusion, crossed his stone-like features. He has my blood, the king stated. It was not a question. It was a fact, spoken with the certainty of a man who had never been wrong. He looked at Fen again, and for the first time, Ilara saw past the terrifying power. She saw a flicker of raw, agonizing hope in those storm-gray eyes, a hope so profound it was indistinguishable from pain. That is impossible, she whispered, her mind reeling. 6 years ago, the king said, his voice dropping, becoming softer, more dangerous. There was a fire at the heart of my citadel. My mate. My son. They were lost. His eyes bored into hers. He was thought to have perished, an infant, not even a week old. Ilara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She looked down at Fen, at his storm-gray eyes, so like the king's. The note. Defective. It wasn't just a cruel insult, it was a lie. A cover for an abandoned prince. Where did you find him? Kalen's voice was quiet, but it held the promise of utter devastation if she did not answer. He was left. She breathed, the words barely audible. On my doorstep, in a blizzard. The Alpha King's jaw tightened. He knelt, slowly, deliberately, until he was at eye level with the small boy cowering behind her. His movements were fluid, graceful, belying his immense size. What is your name, little one? He asked, his voice stripped of its harsh command, softened to something almost gentle. Fen peeked around Ilara's leg. Fen, he whispered. Kalen's expression shattered. For a split second, the mask of the cold king fell away, revealing a man hollowed out by grief. A raw, gaping wound was exposed in his eyes. He reached out a hand, his large, calloused fingers trembling slightly. I have you, he murmured. Not to her, but to the boy. It was a vow. A prayer. Ilara knew in that gut-wrenching moment that her quiet life was over. The world had come to claim her son, and she, the barren exile, was nothing but a footnote in a story far grander and more terrible than she could ever have imagined. The journey to the king's citadel was a silent, tense affair. Kalen had shifted back to his wolf form, and Fen, after a moment of terrified hesitation, had ridden on his broad back, his small hands buried in the thick, dark fur. Ilara had followed on foot, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She watched the massive wolf tread carefully, adjusting his gait for the small, precious burden he carried, and felt a pang of something she refused to name. The citadel was a fortress of black stone and ice, clawing at the sky from the peak of the highest mountain. It was a place of power and sorrow, beautiful in the way a glacier was beautiful, cold, merciless, and permanent. Inside, it was no warmer. The stone halls echoed with their footsteps, the air thick with silence and the scent of old grief. Servants and guards averted their eyes, their faces a mixture of shock and fear as they saw the small, limping boy with the king. Kalen led them to a suite of rooms, larger than her entire cabin. A fire was already roaring in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill of the place. These will be your quarters, he said, his voice once again distant, formal. He had retreated back behind his kingly mask. You will be the boy's caretaker. You will want for nothing." The words were a dismissal, a redefinition of her role. She was not a mother. She was a caretaker, an employee. "His name is Fen," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Kalen's gaze snapped to hers. "His name," he corrected, his voice like chipping ice, "is Phelan, Prince of the North." The finality in his tone was a wall between them. He was reclaiming his son, erasing the life she had given him. He turned to the boy. "Phelan," he said, testing the name. Phelan, looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "I want Mama," he whispered, his lip trembling. The king's face tightened. He looked at Alara, a complex storm of emotions in his eyes, gratitude, suspicion, and a resentment he could not hide. She had 6 years with his son that he had been denied. He was a king, but in this, she was richer than he. "You will stay," he commanded, his gaze pinning her. "For now. I need to know everything, how he survived, who you are." And so began their strange, strained arrangement. Alara's world was now one of cold stone, rich tapestries, and suffocating etiquette. She was a ghost in the king's court, the strange exile who had appeared with the lost prince. The whispers followed her everywhere. They called her a witch, a kidnapper, a charlatan. She ignored them, focusing all her energy on Fen. The boy was struggling, adrift in this new, grand world. He missed their cabin, the quiet of the woods. He was afraid of the stern, sad man who was his father. Kalen was clumsy in his attempts to connect with his son. He brought him extravagant gifts: a pony, a finely crafted sword too heavy for him to lift, when all the boy wanted was a story before bed. Alara became the bridge between them. She would coax Fen out from under the bed and encourage him to show his father the small wooden wolf he had carved. She would gently suggest to the king that perhaps a walk in the castle gardens would be better than formal lessons. Kalen watched her. He was always watching. His presence was a constant weight at the edge of her awareness. She would feel his gaze on her as she helped Fen with his meals, or as she sat by the fire, mending the boy's tunic. He said little, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes followed her every move. One evening she found him in the castle's glass-roofed conservatory. It was a place of death. The once lush plants were withered and brown, choked by the pervasive cold of the castle. It had been his queen's garden, the servants whispered. He had not allowed anyone to touch it since she died. He was standing before a dead rose bush, its branches like skeletal fingers. He didn't seem to notice her arrival. "He has her smile," Kalen said to the dead plant, his voice thick with unshed grief. "My Lyrael. When he smiles, I see her." Ilara's heart ached for the centuries of loss etched on his face. Without thinking, she walked to a pot containing a brittle, lifeless fern. She reached out and touched one of its dry fronds. She remembered that night with Fen, the strange warmth that had flowed from her hands. She closed her eyes, focusing on the memory of her love for the boy, on the fierce, protective instinct that had kept him alive. She felt it again, a gentle pulse of warmth flowing from her palm into the plant. When she opened her eyes, a tiny, vibrant green curl was unfurling from the base of the dead stalk. A sharp intake of breath behind her made her snatch her hand back as if burned. Kalen was staring at the new shoot, then at her, his storm-gray eyes wide with disbelief. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. I don't know," she stammered, terrified. Magic was feared, and her old pack had punished any sign of it. He strode toward her, closing the distance between them in 2 long steps. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm but not painful. His thumb brushed over her palm, his touch sending a jolt of heat through her. He looked from her hand to her face, his expression one of intense, consuming curiosity. "You kept him alive," he said, more to himself than to her. "In the wilderness. A sick pup that even my best healers would have struggled to save. How? She couldn't answer. She didn't have one. He did not press her. He simply stood there holding her hand, his gaze searching hers. The cold stone of his expression was cracking, revealing the confused, lonely man beneath. The boundary he had erected between them, king and caretaker, was beginning to erode. In the silent, dead garden, something new and fragile was taking root. From that day on, something shifted. The arrangement, once so clear, became muddied. Kaelin began seeking her out, often under the pretense of discussing Fen. But their conversations would drift. He would ask about her life in the woods, about the herbs she used, about the stories she told the boy. He spoke of his own past, of the queen he had lost, his words sparse but heavy with a grief that had never healed. He was still a king, formidable and distant to the rest of his court. But with her, in the quiet moments, he was just Kaelin, a man drowning in a silent sea of sorrow. And she, the woman who had been defined by her uselessness, found herself becoming his anchor. One night she was awoken by a noise. Kaelin was standing in the doorway of her room, a shadow against the dim light of the hall. "He had a nightmare," he said, his voice rough. "He called for you." She went to Fen's room. The boy was tangled in his sheets, whimpering in his sleep. Kaelin stood helplessly in the corner, a giant frozen by his inability to offer comfort. Alara sat on the bed and gathered Fen into her arms, stroking his hair and murmuring soft reassurances. He settled almost instantly, his breathing evening out. When she looked up, Kaelin was watching them, his face a raw canvas of longing and pain. He had all the power in the world, but he could not give his son this simple peace. She could. "Thank you," he whispered, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. He took a step closer, reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, but then his hand fell back to his side. The space between them crackled with unspoken things. With a need so profound it was terrifying. The court began to notice. The whispers changed from suspicion to jealousy. The king was spending too much time with the exile. He was letting her influence him. The most vocal of the dissenters was Lord Valerius. Valerius was the king's oldest advisor, a man whose loyalty was said to be as unshakable as the mountain the citadel was built on. He had been there when Kaelin's queen was murdered, had helped the king hunt down the rival pack supposedly responsible. He treated Alara with a cloying, false courtesy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "It is a marvel, the work you have done with the young prince," he would say, his smile never reaching his cold, calculating eyes. To think a common exile could possess such skill. She felt a deep, instinctual revulsion toward him. When he was near Fen, she would position herself between them, a primal urge to protect her son from a predator she couldn't name. The threat, when it came, was subtle at first. Valerius began to subtly undermine her. He suggested that Fen needed a more suitable tutor, a noblewoman to teach him the ways of the court. He brought in other healers to attend to the boy's minor scrapes, pointedly ignoring Ilara. He was trying to sever her from Fen, to push her back into the role of a meaningless servant. Kaelin, to his credit, resisted. "Ilara stays," he would command, his voice flat and non-negotiable, his eyes daring Valerius to challenge him. The tension in the court grew thick enough to choke on. One night, a terrible scream tore through the silence of the royal wing. Alara was out of her bed in an instant, her heart pounding. She burst into Fen's room to find him sitting bolt upright in bed, his face pale with terror, tears streaming down his cheeks. Kaelin was already there, trying to comfort the boy, but Fen was inconsolable. "The fire!" he shrieked, his small body trembling violently. "The fireman! He hurt Mama!" Alara froze. Kaelin looked at her, his face grim. "Another nightmare." "No," Alara said, her blood running cold. She went to Fen, holding him tight. Fen, look at me. It was a dream. I'm right here. I'm safe. Not you. He sobbed into her shoulder. My other mama. The one with the sunny hair. The fireman. He had a bad smile. Kalen went rigid. He stared at his son, the implications of the boy's words settling like a shroud. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory. A fragmented memory from an infant who should have remembered nothing. Who, Phelan? Kalen's voice was dangerously quiet. Who was the fireman? But Fen was too lost in his terror to answer. He just kept sobbing, repeating the words, bad smile, over and over again. Later, after Fen had cried himself to sleep in Alara's arms, Kalen stood by the window, staring out at the frozen landscape. The pack we destroyed for Lyrael's murder. They swore their innocence to the last, he said, his voice hollow. I thought it was a lie to save their own skins. But if the man who set the fire was inside the citadel... Alara's mind raced. The unease she felt around Valerius. His constant veiled animosity. His attempts to separate her from Fen. A bad smile. Valerius's smile was a mask. A polite lie. Valerius, she whispered, the name tasting like poison. Kalen turned from the window, his face a thundercloud. He has been my most trusted advisor for 2 centuries. He loved Lyrael like a daughter. You are accusing him of treason and murder based on a child's nightmare. I am telling you what I feel, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. He looks at Fen not with joy, but with hatred. He sees a ghost. A problem that has returned. Kalen was torn. His loyalty to his old friend warred with the undeniable truth in his son's terror and the instinct he was beginning to feel from her. He was an alpha. He trusted his senses, and his senses were screaming that the woman before him was his mate, the other half of his soul. Her instincts were becoming his own. I will look into it, he said finally, his voice tight, but quietly. If you are wrong, Alara. He didn't finish the threat. He didn't have to. But they were out of time. Valerius knew he was exposed. The boy remembered. And the exile was putting the pieces together. He could not allow Kalen to start digging into the past. He had to act. The attack came 2 days later. It was brutally efficient. A diversion on the western wall drew most of the castle guard, a feigned raid by a bordering pack. In the chaos, Valerius struck. Alara was with Fen in the gardens. She had been coaxing a patch of winter jasmine back to life, the boy watching in fascination as green shoots appeared on the dead vines. Suddenly, a primal roar of agony and rage echoed through the citadel, a sound so powerful it shook the very stones. It was Kalen's voice. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped her. Fen, stay here, she commanded, before running toward the sound, toward the king's throne room. Guards were rushing past her, their faces pale with shock. She pushed her way through the throng, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scene in the throne room was one of carnage. 2 of the king's personal guard lay dead. And in the center of the room, Kalen was on one knee, his greatsword on the floor beside him. He was clutching his chest, his face contorted in a mask of agony. Valerius stood over him, a thin, curved blade in his hand. The dagger dripped with a black, viscous substance. Its edge was coated in silver, but it was the poison that was killing the king. A pity, Valerius said, his voice calm, his smile finally, truly revealed. It was a venomous, triumphant thing, the bad smile. The assassins were skilled, a tragedy for the northern packs. But do not worry, I will assume the throne and ensure the prince is protected. Kalen tried to rise, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he collapsed back to the floor. A strange, unnatural frost was spreading across his skin, originating from the wound. His breath plumed in the air, which was growing colder by the second. The poison was not just killing him, it was freezing him from the inside out. No, Ilara whispered, the word a choked sob. Valerius's eyes found her in the doorway. Ah, the little exile. A loose end. He gestured to the guards who had followed him into the room, his own loyal men. Seize her. Lock her away. She is clearly in league with the assassins. The guards advanced on her. Alara backed away, her mind screaming. Kaelin was dying. Fen was alone. The man who had murdered his mother was about to take everything. Despair washed over her, a cold, crushing wave. It felt just like the day she had been cast out, the day she found Fen on her doorstep. She was helpless, powerless. Kaelin looked at her, his storm-gray eyes dimming. He mouthed a single word. Run. But she couldn't. She would not abandon him. She would not leave her son to this monster. The guards grabbed her arms. Their touch was rough, bruising. They began to drag her away from the throne room, away from the dying king. She fought, but it was useless. She could hear Valerius giving orders, his voice smooth and confident as he took control of the citadel. They threw her into a cold, dark cell in the dungeon. The heavy stone door slammed shut, the sound of the bolt sliding home an echo of finality. She was alone in the dark, the chilling dampness of the stone seeping into her clothes. The king was dying. The murderer was on the throne, and she was locked in a cage. It was the lowest point, the uttermost despair. She curled into a ball on the filthy straw, a single guttural sob tearing from her throat. She had found a home, a family, only to have it ripped away. Hope was a crueler poison than any Valerius could concoct. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. Time had no meaning in the darkness. Her grief slowly burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard ember of rage. She would not let it end this way. She would not let him win. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to get back to Kaelin. The strange warmth in her hands, the life she had poured into Fen, into the dead plants. It was her only weapon. A desperate, impossible chance. The sound of the bolt sliding back made her jolt upright. A single guard stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Loris, a young man from the king's personal guard, one of the few who had always shown her kindness. His face was grim. "The king is fading," he whispered, his voice urgent. "The healers can do nothing. The frost is consuming him. Valerius has declared himself regent. He says the king's last wish was to place the pack in his care." "It's a lie," Alara said, her voice a raw rasp. "We know," Loris said, "those of us still loyal. But we are too few. We cannot move against him openly." He looked at her, his eyes full of a desperate plea. "But you, the king, he trusted you. When he spoke your name, the frost receded for a moment. I saw it." Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her despair. "Take me to him." Loris led her through secret passages, the hidden arteries of the citadel that only the royal guard knew. They moved like ghosts, avoiding the patrols of Valerius's men. The cold in the castle was now profound, a supernatural chill that clung to the very stones. Kaelin's life force was the heart of the citadel, and as he died, his home was dying with him. They reached the king's chambers. Two guards loyal to Loris stood outside. Inside, the room was like a tomb. The roaring fire in the hearth gave off no heat. Frost coated the windows, intricate, deathly patterns of ice. Kaelin lay on the great bed, his body unnaturally still. His skin was pale, tinged with blue. A thick layer of frost covered his chest around the wound, spreading like a frozen disease across his body. He was barely breathing. Fen was there, huddled in a chair in the corner, watched over by an old, trusted nanny. He was weeping silently, his small face streaked with tears. "He's so cold," he whispered when he saw Alara. She rushed to the bedside. Kaelin's skin was like touching ice. His life was guttering like a dying candle flame. The healers stood by, helpless. "There is nothing more we can do," one of them said, his voice heavy with defeat. The poison is magical. It devours life and leaves only ice. Get out, Alara commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. The healers, startled, obeyed. Loris and his men stood guard at the door. She was alone with her son and the man she loved. You cannot leave us, she whispered, her hand hovering over his frozen chest. I will not let you. Fen came to stand beside her, his small hand taking hers. Don't go, Papa, he pleaded. Alara placed her hands on the wound. The cold was shocking, a pain that shot up her arms, stealing her own warmth. She ignored it. She closed her eyes and focused. Not on a memory of love this time, but on the ferocious, roaring reality of it. Her love for Fen. Her love for this broken, beautiful king. It was a fire in her soul, a defiant blaze against the encroaching ice. She poured it all into him, every memory, finding Fen in the snow, his first laugh. Kalen's eyes the first time he truly saw her, the feel of his hand in hers in the dead garden. She poured her grief, her rage, her hope, her very life force through her hands. No, she said, the word of vow. I choose you. I choose this life. You will not take it from me. The warmth came, but this time it was not a gentle bloom. It was a flood. A torrent of power erupted from her, so strong it threw her back a step. A brilliant, blinding light, the color of new leaves and summer sun, exploded from her hands. It was pure life energy, raw and untamed. The light enveloped Kalen's body. The frost on his skin sizzled and vanished, turning to steam. The blue tint of his skin receded, replaced by a healthy flush. The wound on his chest, a black, festering crater of necrotic flesh, began to knit itself together. New skin, clean and unmarred, spread across the injury until it was gone completely. The wave of power radiated outward from the bed. The frost on the windows melted, running down the glass in streams. The fire in the hearth roared to life, filling the room with warmth and light. A vase of dead flowers on the mantel burst into vibrant, impossible bloom. The very air in the room felt clean, alive, renewed. Alara stood panting, her body trembling with the aftershock of the power that had flowed through her. She had not just healed him, she had resurrected him. She looked at her hands, no longer the hands of a simple forager, but the conduits of a force she could not comprehend. Then Kalen's eyes opened. The storm gray was gone, replaced by the molten gold of his wolf form. They were blazing with power, with life, and with a love so intense it buckled her knees. He sat up, his movements fluid, powerful. He was not just healed, he was stronger. The last vestiges of his old grief burned away by the pure life magic she had poured into him. He looked at her, and the whole world fell away. He reached for her, pulling her onto the bed and into his arms. His touch was warm, solid, real. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with the force of his emotions. You saved me, he breathed, his voice thick. Alara. He pulled back, his hands framing her face. His golden eyes searched hers. He saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw only her. I love you, he said, the words a raw, undeniable truth. I think I have from the moment I saw you standing in the snow, a tiny, defiant shield for my son. I was just too blind with grief to see it. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, of joy. I love you, she whispered back. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a king's kiss of possession, but a kiss of equals, a kiss of desperation and gratitude, and a love that had literally conquered death. It was a promise, a homecoming. A small voice broke the spell. Papa! They both turned. Fen was standing by the bed, his eyes wide with awe. Kalen smiled, a true, brilliant smile that transformed his harsh features. He opened his arm, and Fen scrambled onto the bed, burrowing between them. Kalen wrapped his arms around both of them, his mate and his son, holding his entire world. The reunion was cut short by the sound of shouting in the hall. Loras burst into the room, his face pale. "My king, Valerius is coming." He heard the commotion. He has his men with him. Kalen rose from the bed. He was wearing only his breeches, his bare chest glowing with residual power. He looked every inch the wrathful king he was. "Let him come," he growled, his voice a low thunder. The doors to the chamber burst open. Valerius strode in, flanked by a dozen of his guards. He stopped dead, his face a mask of utter shock and disbelief when he saw Kalen standing there, alive and radiating power. "Impossible," Valerius breathed. "You were always ambitious, Valerius," Kalen said, his voice dangerously calm. "But you were a fool to think you could steal my throne, to murder my queen, to leave my son to die in the snow." Valerius's composure cracked. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. They fell on Fen, who was clinging to Alara's leg. The boy, no longer terrified, pointed a small, trembling finger. "The fireman," Fen said, his voice clear and loud. "The bad smile." It was the final nail in his coffin. The guards behind Valerius, men who had served Kalen for years, hesitated. Their loyalty to the regent wavered in the face of their resurrected king and the damning testimony of his heir. "Lies!" Valerius snarled, drawing his sword. "The exile has bewitched you all." He lunged, not at Kalen, but at Alara and Fen. It was a desperate, final gamble. He never made it. Kalen moved in a blur of speed and fury. Before Valerius could take a second step, the king's hand was around his throat, lifting him from the floor. Valerius choked, his sword clattering uselessly to the stone. "You will not touch them!" Kalen snarled, his eyes blazing gold. "Not now. Not ever." With a final brutal twist, it was over. Valerius's body fell to the floor, lifeless. The remaining guards dropped to their knees, their heads bowed in submission to their true Alpha King. Kalen turned his back on the body, his fury vanishing as his gaze fell on Alara and Fen. He walked to them and knelt, gathering them both into his arms. The next day, he called the entire court to the throne room. He stood before them, Alara by his side, his hand holding hers. Fen stood proudly before them, his limp barely noticeable. Kalen told them everything: Valerius's betrayal, Alara's courage, the miracle of his survival. "This woman," he declared, his voice ringing through the great hall, "whom my own people cast out as worthless, is the savior of this pack. She protected the heir when all others abandoned him. She brought your king back from the brink of death with a power born of pure life. She is not an exile. She is my mate, your queen." A gasp went through the crowd. He pulled Alara forward, placing a gentle kiss on her brow for all to see. It was a public validation, a complete shattering of the lies that had defined her life. The lords and ladies who had whispered behind her back now bowed their heads in deference. She was not just accepted, she was revered. The self-doubt that had been her constant companion for years finally, blessedly, broke. She stood tall, her hand in his, and met the gaze of the court not as a frightened outcast, but as the queen she was always meant to be. 6 months later, the citadel was transformed. The pervasive chill was gone, replaced by a vibrant warmth that had nothing to do with the fires in the hearths. The conservatory was a lush, green paradise, Ilara's gift of life spreading through the castle. Laughter was a common sound in the halls. Ilara found her place not just as a queen, but as a healer. The pack, once fearful of her power, now sought her out. They called her the life-giver, and she tended to their hurts, both physical and spiritual, with a gentle grace. Her favorite moments were the quiet ones, the evenings spent with her family. Kaylin would sit by the fire, carving a small wooden dragon for Fen, his harsh face softened by love and contentment. Fen, no longer the timid, frightened boy, would chatter excitedly about his lessons with the stable master. One evening, Ilara sat watching them, her hand resting on her own belly, where the first stirrings of a new life were beginning to flutter. A new prince or princess, conceived in love, not tragedy. Kaylin looked up, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers across the room. The question was there, unspoken. She simply smiled and nodded. The brilliant, joyous light that filled his face was brighter than any magic. He crossed the room and knelt before her, placing a reverent hand next to hers on her stomach. "Another miracle," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "No," she said, her fingers lacing with his, "just a family." He leaned in and kissed her softly. Outside, the first true snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, peaceful white. But inside the citadel, inside their home, it was forever spring. The exiled girl and the broken king had healed each other, building a new world from the ashes of their pain. They had a home, they had a place, they belonged, and their story, once a tale of sorrow, was now a legend of love that had refused to die.